Alright everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm your host, the Mad, the Dashing, Dash Jovis, and today we're going to do some more tier slop. So we're going to talk about hand traps in the August 2025 format, and just kind of rank them. I've got my tiers from S to D. S is cards that you almost always are going to run. D is cards which you almost never are going to run. I don't have every hand trap in existence here, just a few that I thought were worth talking about. But yeah, let's just get into it. So for starters, Ash, Max C, pretty obvious. You're always going to be running these. Max C is one of the most important cards in the format. It gets negated really easily, so that's a big downside to it. But it also skips your opponent's turn or draws you a few cards, or it does some combination of both. And Malcharmies also being in the format alongside Max C makes Ash even more important than ever. Ash would otherwise be a relatively low impact hand trap, but I think because we've got Max C and all the Malcharmies now, you just kind of have to be running it in your main deck unless your deck isn't weak to Max C, and even then maybe you should be considering it. Droll, also an A tier trap with the Malcharmies. These are cards which will often stop your opponent's turn, or at least significantly reduce the power of their turn. It's not very good against Malice, is its one weakness. However, it's really good in Malice as a way to stop Max C or Malcharmies. And Malice is weak to all the Malcharmies and to Max C, so it actually is, I think, a pretty important card to be running if you're playing Malice. And I think it's a really good card against Ryzeal, so long as you can deal with Detonator. So if you can stop them from making a detonator in the first place, or you can negate the detonator after they've made it, Droll will be really helpful. I'm going to put Dimension Shifter in D, and this is kind of strange because Shifter is obviously a really strong card. Like, it's a really strong card. But in the meta right now, when half the player base is on Malice, which basically doesn't care that much about Shifter, and I mean, Shifter can be played in Malice, but then your Bestials aren't good anymore, and your other hand traps aren't necessarily going to be as effective because you're turning them off with Shifter. Like, you have to build your deck around Shifter, and Shifter's at 1, so I don't think it's actually worth building your whole deck around the one Shifter you have, just to have it not be good in, like, about half of your matches, right? Like, it doesn't seem very effective. I'm going to put Nibiru in B. Nibiru is really good when you pair it with another hand trap. The problem with Nibiru is that basically every deck in the game right now has some way to play either around or under or through a Nibiru. So Nibiru by itself is going to do jack diddly squat. But if you pair it with Droll or with Imperm or Effect Veiler or with Ash Blossom sometimes, or if you Max C them and then draw into the Nibiru after you've hit them with a couple of other hand traps, then it becomes really high impact. You kind of force your opponent to make these plays that they don't want to make and then punish them for them. So I think it's still a hand trap that's worth running. It's also good to have as a crossout target in your deck. If you have crossout designator to answer the Max C, you kind of want to have a copy of Nibiru in your deck just so that when you see crossout, you don't have to respect Nibiru and you can make a better combo. I'm going to put Effect Veiler in C. I'm going to put Imperm in B. I'm going to put Ghost Mourner in D. All these cards are very similar in terms of what they do. They're just single target effect negation, obviously. They're like Ash in that they're kind of low impact hand traps, but if you're playing enough hand traps, you will run them. The thing about Imperm is that it's also a board breaker. You can hold it for your turn and use it to help negate your opponent's board on your turn. And you can also use it to negate things like Duo Drive when they've already set up the cross negate. So it is a lot better than Effect Veiler, and it's also a lot better because it pairs really well with the Dominus traps, which I am going to put in A because I think you're always running the Dominus traps provided that your deck doesn't naturally, like, they have restrictions based on what attributes you're allowed to run with them, so you're not always going to be running them, and sometimes you might consider them too low impact to run. Like, you might be prioritizing Malcharmies or Droll or Max C or even Nibiru in this metagame. You might be prioritizing some of those over them. But I think in general, you will be running these and Imperm in the decks that can run these. So maybe they're even S, but I don't think they're quite that good because they're not very high impact and they're not run in literally everything, right? I have cut the Purge from decks that can run Purge before because it's a weaker Ash Blossom like 90% of the time. And Ash Blossom, as I said, is already not high impact. And it doesn't stop Max C unless they already have a card on the field. So it's not as useful as Ash Blossom in terms of stopping Max C and Mulch Armies. In fact, it never stops a Mulch Army, right? So Gamma, I'm going to put solidly in C. So like if you're running the Primite cards, then maybe Driver isn't too big of a brick to handle. Like maybe it's not the end of the world to play one Driver, one Gamma if you're playing Primite. And that's the only reason I would see to play one Gamma, one Driver. You could run Delta alongside Gamma, but then you have multiple hand traps that can't be used together that are essentially one use once per turn hand traps. And like, yeah, you can use them to make things on your own turn if you negate your opponent's stuff while you have nothing on the field. But typically, you only get one use out of your Psy-Frame cards. Especially if we're talking about like the Driver getting banished at the end of the turn. So like, yeah, if you're playing Psy-Frame, you obviously are going to play Gamma, and maybe if you're playing a pure hand trap pile or a Primite pile, you'll play Gamma. It's a very strong hand trap. I thought even at 2, it was worth playing 2 Gamma, 1 Driver in decks that get a lot of things started off of spells and traps, because you can activate it in order to protect your play and get an 8 Synchro 8 at the start of your turn. That is incredibly powerful. But you know, one Driver, 1 Gamma, it's a terrible ratio. Even at 2, I thought it was sometimes worth it. At 1, I don't think it's worth it most of the time. Herald of the Arclight, I'm going to put an S, because I think if you're playing a Fairy deck, you're always going to run Herald of the Arclight. Gives you more answers to Max C, gives you answers to other hand traps and Mulch Armies. It gives you answers to your opponent's plays on their turn. That's really powerful, negating and destroying any monster effect. Extremely powerful. The thing is, like Shifter, this can only be played in certain decks. So like if you're playing Melodious, yeah, you're always going to jam 3 of these. But it's hard to think about what other decks in the format, you know, and that Melodious isn't particularly common in the format anyway. So it's not like you're going to see this everywhere. This isn't an S because you're always running it in every deck. It's an S because you're always running it in the decks that it can be run in. Lancea, I'm going to put it in D. You still do see this a lot. I think you see it a lot more than you should. It's really good against Malice, and this stands in for Chaos Hunter as well as Lancea, although Chaos Hunter is significantly weaker. But yeah, you do still see this a lot. It's really good against Malice. It has applications against Called by the Grave and Crossout, so it's not a completely dead card. It's a good way to sack people and win some games if you draw it with other hand traps and your opponent has Called by or Crossout. But it doesn't really do anything against most of the decks in the format. And yeah, there's a lot of Malice on the ladder, but like playing anti-Malice cards in your deck and then just seeing those instead of your good draws against Ryzeal just seems like a bad idea. Like, I think Best of 1 makes this card a lot worse. If you could side this card, you would always side this card. But because we don't have siding in Master Duel, yeah, it's just a Best of 1. It's just not a good card in Best of 1. You'd rather have something that you can actually use in your hand trap slot. Hi, Vinny. Bestials. So I've got Magnamut standing in here, which is obviously one of the better Bestials, but all the Bestials are kind of good, and you tend to run them as an engine if you're running them. Although Malice will just run the best of them. I'm going to put it in B. Because, yeah, you're always going to run some number of Bestials in Malice, and it's not a terrible thing to have some Bestials in your deck. You're always going to run the 1 Magnamut and Blue Eyes, probably, right? Like, even if you're running Dominus Purge, I think it's worth it to have the 1 Magnamut to summon off of Seal and to search for your Primite cards and maybe to search for Neo Kaiser Seahorse if you're on that. But if you're not playing a Dragon deck for Magnamute, or you're not playing a deck that banishes its own cards from the graveyard like Malice, then the Bestials get a lot weaker in this format. There's just too many things that they can do to play around Bestials. Too many decks that don't get hit by Bestials even though they're graveyard decks, right? Like Crystron is a really strong deck, and Bestials do stone nothing against them, and it just ends up not being worthwhile. I'm going to put Ghost Bell in C. It's sort of like Lancea in that it negates Called by the Grave, but it's a little bit better than that. It's very low impact. It does some good stuff. It pairs pretty nicely with other hand traps, but if all you see in your hand is a Ghost Bell, you're probably not stopping your opponent from doing a lot of stuff. So even though it's not a terrible hand trap, I think generally speaking, you probably shouldn't be running it right now. Although maybe I put it in B because it's good against a lot of the same stuff Bestials are, and you could consider running it over Bestials if in this format, because the Bestials are just, they don't have a lot of great targets in this format. But I generally think Bestials, when they do something, are pretty high impact actually, especially if you see multiple Bestials and you have like Baldrake, Druisworm, Baldrake, Magnamute, or whatever, or Bestial Engines. So I think they're just a little bit stronger to run in general. DD Crow, I'm going to call Crow a C as well. These are not really ordered in their tier as best to worst or anything. They're just put into a tier. But I'm going to say DD Crow is it's good against Crystron. It's good against Mermail Atlantean at least some of the time. It does pair pretty nicely with other hand traps, and it does everything Bestials do except get you the body and more, because it actually hits a bunch of other decks that Bestials can't hit. But I'm not a big fan of playing multiple Crow. Maybe you want to play one Crow to have as a crossout target if you're a deck that's particularly weak to DD Crow. Maybe you want to play one Crow in your deck as a way to counter Crystron, just have an out to the Crystron deck, have an out to the Mermail deck. But it doesn't really do much against Ryzeal or Malice. Like, it can hurt Malice slightly by denying them a Bestial, but they're still going to get to summon the monster out of the graveyard. So like, that can pair really well with Nibiru, but it isn't actually good. You can get rid of Myriologic Aggregator from their graveyard so that they can't attach it to their extra or to their Ryzeal Detonator, but it doesn't really do anything against Ryzeal other than like deny them a draw, basically. So Retaliating C, I'm going to put it in D. You might want to run this on occasion, and there's two reasons for it. One is that if it goes to the graveyard from the field, you get to search max C. So I've seen pure hand trap builds, decks that are just all hand traps and Bestials that are trying to win the game by just stopping the opponent and then slowly whittling away at their health with Bestials. I've seen those play this card before. Joshua Schmidt was a big fan of that. But in the format where he was doing that, there was a lot of spells and traps that allowed you to summon monsters in the game. Like, there was OSS, and there was the Azamina spell and trap, and all that stuff. And right now, you're not really seeing a lot of spells and traps that summon monsters. This doesn't affect the field spell in Malice, because that technically just banishes a monster, and then the effect of the monster summons itself. So you just don't have good targets against the main decks in the format for Retaliating C right now. And I'm going to put Contact C a little bit higher. Do I put it in C or in B? Because Contact C, I'm going to put it in C. Contact C is actually pretty good right now. Malice can link it off, but Ryzeal can't really. If they're just playing like pure Xyz Slop Ryzeal, then you've put a 6 on their board and they can't make any Xyz monsters. So it's good against Ryzeal, bad against Malice, and so maybe you would consider it in the same way. Maybe I'm going to put it in D then, because it's a lot like Lancea, where it's really good against some of the decks in the format and really bad against other decks in the format. and if you can find the right matchups, it's totally worth running. But maybe you just don't want to put that much respect on Ryzeal, on pure Ryzeal, when there's other decks in the format. Like, for example, Fiendsmith Ryzeal can very often just make Moon if you Contact See them, and then they've made Moon with your Contact See and you've actually given them material. So yeah, maybe it's just not worth running right now. You don't see it a lot, so I'm not really sure about that. Maybe it's better than I think. Spooky Dogwood, or as I like to call it, Spooky Dogwater. Spooky Dogwood is almost never good. You know, people have sometimes played it for time rules in TCG. We don't have that in Master Duel. People have also occasionally played it just as a, well, you do your full combo, I get enough life points that I'm going to survive a turn, and then I can do my thing on my turn and beat you. And that does work in Master Duel, but I don't think it's particularly good. You know, gaining a ton of life points and then having your opponent, like, you might be able to survive a turn, but will you have the resources to actually beat their board after you've let them do a whole bunch of stuff? You know, it's not a max C, and with Mulcharmies in the format, I think these are much more effective ways at punishing the opponent for summoning monsters. Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries, I'm going to put in C. You know, if you run Ryzeal Detonator and Malice, what's it called? White Binder, and you run Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries, you can really fuck up both the Malice and Ryzeal decks game plans just off of one hand trap. And a good portion of the format is just those two cards. Add a Spirit Dragon and you're covering for all the blue eyes on the ladder, and you've got a good chunk of the meta actually covered. But it's so specific, and yeah, you'll really get the Ryzeal player by getting rid of their Detonator, but like, if they're playing Fiendsmith Ryzeal, they have other things they can do. Even if they're playing Ryzeal, they'll just make different rank 4s, and yeah, none of those are as good as Detonator, but like, it's not, it's a good way to get somebody, but I don't think it's actually that effective in the meta. Like, I don't think it's actually that good. But at the same time, if you're having trouble with Ryzeal and you just want to banish their Detonators from their extra deck, then play Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries. Like, if you just want to build an anti-Ryzeal deck and farm Ryzeal, you could probably do pretty well playing this card. So it's not a D, but I'm going to put it in C. And then we have Ceravis. And Ceravis is an A in decks that can summon Ceravis, like Voiceless Voice in particular I'm thinking about. And it's a D in decks that can't. Basically, I don't think using a hand trap to negate a called by, or an Imperm or an Effect Veiler is actually that good right now. Like, it could be useful, it could win you a game, but like, it's not going to be as effective as Called by the Grave or Crossout Designator in general. And unless you actually have another use for the Ceravis, I would say you don't usually want to run this card. But I just wanted to talk about it because in Voiceless Voice it is particularly strong. So yeah, that's what the tier list looks like. I guess I'm going to talk a little bit about Ghost Mourner too, because I didn't really go into a lot of detail. The reason Ghost Mourner is weaker than Effect Veiler is that I think right now you want to be Effect Veilering the normal summon a lot of the time. And so Ghost Mourner doesn't do that. It doesn't actually Effect Veiler the normal summon. And like, yeah, sometimes they're going to be doing a special summon first in order to start their combo with Extra Ryzeal or with Gold Sarcophagus. But like, if they start with a normal summon, you don't have a good target for Ghost Mourner at all. Yeah. Alright, so that's the list. I will see you guys next time. Have a good life. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And bye!